Hey guys, welcome back. With this lecture today, we're going to be going a little bit more into the politics during this time period, moving away from the reform movements that we've been talking about and Southern society. So let's kick it off. This is the era of manifest destiny. This was a term coined in 1845 by John O'Sullivan in a newspaper, talking about the ever expansion of westward migration by peoples of the United States. And you could say that this was an 1800s phenomenon. I know y'all have heard of Manifest Destiny. That's the one thing that like all of my students always remember from middle school. But it wasn't just in the 1800s. I mean, if you want to get technical, this is something that had begun as soon as the European colonizers had first stepped foot in North America. As soon as our United States journey began with like Jamestown in 1607, you could say that we were pushing, or that Europeans we're pushing westward, that this was manifest destiny. And it goes to like our God-given right that we had this destiny to expand from East Coast all the way to the West Coast of California and beyond, as we'll see by the late 1800s. So that's a theme throughout this section we're going to be covering. But with the politics, it's in the 1820s and the 1830s that you see the emergence of the second party system. This is going to be following the very contentious elections. Remember how dirty they got? Of 1824, which was literally called the corrupt bargain. It was that backdoor deal between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, supposedly, right? Where maybe John Quincy Adams agreed to give Henry Clay the position of Secretary of State, and in return, Henry Clay, as Speaker of the House, agreed to award John Quincy Adams the presidency, regardless of the fact that Andrew Jackson had received more votes and more electoral college votes than anybody else in that race. And then in 1828, in the grudge match, the rematch between the JQA and Jackson, the Jackson supporters had basically formed, especially with the help of the little magician, Martin Van Buren, a new political party called the Democrats. And with this base of support and with very fierce personal attacks on both sides, Jackson claims a very strong victory in 1828. Kind of also on the back of this was the democratization of America that was happening at this time. The more white men, not women, not people of color, but more white men, especially more poor white men, were able to vote in 1828 than had ever previously been able to obtain suffrage in our country. And this was because many states had dropped their property requirements as a qualification to voting. And so that is why we say that this is the age of Jackson. This is democracy in America, because this having a voice in our country was expanding. The right to vote was expanding in the United States. And basically, the second party system is going to come about in reaction to Jackson and his new party, the Democrats. You will get an opposition rising during Jackson's presidency that will eventually coalesce into what we call the Whig Party. So the Whigs are born out of frustration with Jackson and his policies. Basically, if you want to follow through, remember that the first party system was the Federalist under kind of like Alexander Hamilton and Hamilton's financial plan in the 1790s versus the new Democratic Republican Party under Thomas Jefferson, who opposed all of Hamilton's financial measures. And the Democratic Republicans after the War of 1812 had been like the only party remaining since the Federalists shot themselves in the foot at the Hartford Convention. Oh, this War of 1812 was so dumb. Oh, did you hear that Andrew Jackson beat the British in New Orleans in a pretty amazing victory? Whoops. Yeah, so that was the end of the Federalist Party. And so that era of good feelings, remember, we had sectional differences rising. And eventually, here's what we get. Again, the second party system, it's the Democrats under Jackson versus the Whigs, who are mainly going to be, from different leaders, but the main one inspiring the Whigs will be like Henry Clay, who we've talked about a lot. Remember, he's Speaker of the House, Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams, very, very important in Congress. This is Henry Clay with his American system. And so the American plan or American system is a big tenet. It's a big part of the Whig Party and what they believe in. It's kind of like, you want to compare it to the first party system, it's sort of like Hamilton's financial plan. Remember, that involved assumption of state debts from the Revolutionary War by the national government. To pay off those debts, we'd have an excise tax on whiskey. Remember, that led to things like the Whiskey Rebellion. People didn't like that. And that also led to the creation of the First National Bank, which was heavily opposed by the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republican Party. Well, Henry Clay's American plan, the American system that we've talked about since the end of the War of 1812 in 1815, because historians are the worst, involved three main things, remember? It involved the creation of a new national bank to replace the old one. Now, at this point under Jackson, remember that the bank wars had exacerbated this political partisanship. Partisanship is when the two parties are splitting and they hate each other and they're on oppositional sides. Jackson had declared war against the bank, and Nicholas Biddle, the bank's director, and had basically vetoed the renewal charter of the Second National Bank and killed it. Jackson killed the bank. And it was supposed to be rechartered in 1836. That did not happen. It was dead. So Henry Clay's American system called for a new national bank. It also called for stronger tariffs. Now remember, tariffs are taxes on traded goods. They benefit largely the northern region because that's where we have more industry and factories than, say, like in the South, which is more agricultural. And the third part of the American plan was also improvements in infrastructure that the national government would pay for, would subsidize large infrastructure improvements such as roads, canals, bridges, and by the 1830s, even the emergence of railroads. And these would be interstate goals and projects that the federal government would help the states pay for. Okay, so that is a main thing that the new Whig Party believes in. And by the way, the name Whig comes from like the British Whig Party. So they're not just all about, oh, look at my fancy wigs. No, they're naming themselves off the Whig Party, which in Britain originated as a party that was opposed to the monarchy, the king. You can see in this political cartoon right here on the right, it says born to command. Who is this guy dressed up in all this kingly regalia, posed like a European monarch? Well, that is Andrew Jackson, King Andrew the First. So this would be a political cartoon probably from Jackson's opponents, these new Whigs led by like Henry Clay there, right? And they're saying he's holding the veto. That's like he vetoed the national bank. He killed the renewal charter for the second bus. That was seen as something that was just straight up wrong. Like, this is something that Jackson did just because he didn't like the bank, not because it was, as previous presidents had vetoed, because it was an unconstitutional thing. Whigs felt that Jackson had did this just out of spite and own personal preference, and that was wrong. That was something like a monarch, a dictator, a king would do. And so this is a political cartoon ridiculing Jackson's authoritarian approach to the presidency. It's interesting to note that when Lincoln first started off in politics during the 1840s, he was a Whig. We don't yet have the Republican Party. They're on the way. They'll form in the 1850s, but we don't have them yet. This is the second party system. Again, for the third time, it is the Democrats under Jackson versus the Whigs under like Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. And in the North, you have, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Daniel Webster. There we go, Daniel Webster. And those are some of like the main Whig leaders at this time. Some of the key Whig policies that you'll see enacted later on by Lincoln, kind of showing his Whig influence, will be the National Banking Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Homestead Act in 1862, which granted cheap lands in the Great Plains to poor families. Basically almost at no cost, they could settle that, and that settled the West. The Morrill Land Act, which granted money for education and higher education like colleges, and even more money for technical schooling, vocational training. Whigs also supported the moral reforms that we've seen come about because of the Second Great Awakening. Whigs were big supporters, at least in the North and in some places, Northern Whigs would be supporters of things like abolition and women's suffrage for some. It's not a guarantee. And there's also important to note that there were like Northern Democrats as well. And there were also Southern Whigs. It wasn't just that the Whigs were in the North and the Democrats were in the South, but that is probably more true than the opposite, okay? Now the Democrats under Jackson and his little magician, that little fox of Kinderhook, Martin Van Buren, who was the only president, Martin Van Buren, to have English as his second language. He grew up in his little neighborhood there in New York, speaking primarily Dutch, hence the Van Buren. It's a Dutch name, but he was born in the United States in New York. So the Democratic Party, you could see in the second party system chart over here, they are more in line with like the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans in that they favor state government over the central government. The Whigs, they're more in line with the Federalists. They favor a stronger central authority. And I mean, you could go all the way back even before the first party system, to when we had the debate over ratification of the Constitution, and those two earliest of factions, I don't want to call them political parties because the nation wasn't yet formed. And I know that gets confusing for you guys because I've seen it on your discussion questions where you're constantly confusing the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist with the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Not exactly the same thing, but I could see where you make that mistake because they're similar. We see progression and evolution of these political parties because the Democrats certainly come from the Democratic Republicans, who certainly seem to come from the Anti-Federalists. The Whigs, in turn, seem to come from the Federalists who came from, you guessed it, the Federalists during the ratification debate. But that is certainly the case here. And you can see the Democrats, they opposed government action in general, at least by the federal governments, the national governments. They oppose government spending. They don't want big government interference. Again, they want more states to be able to decide things. And they are generally opposed to tariffs because Democrats' power base is in the West and particularly in the South. And tariffs do not help the South. They hurt the South because the South is primarily reliant on exports of raw materials such as indigo and tobacco and cotton. Cotton is huge, right? And they have to import a lot of manufactured goods. They don't have much, they have some, but they don't have a lot of manufacturing or industry in the South. So they need to import those things. Having a tax on those imports means they will be the ones to have to pay. It will not help them in any way. And then it also hurts them the other way as well, if you think about it, because having a tariff makes it harder for foreign governments to sell things to the United States because people will be less inclined to pay for those things because it costs more, which in turn makes it harder for those foreign nations such as England to buy Southern cotton because then they're not getting, in turn, enough revenue from their manufactured sales. So it all kind of circles around. Tariffs in general, though, just to keep it simple, they benefit the North because that's where the factories are, and they hurt the South. Democrats are skeptical about the moral legislation surrounding the Second Great Awakening. For instance, the temperance movement, and especially abolition. Because again, Southern way of life, especially for the wealthy planter class, revolves around the institution of slavery. That's how they make their money, by having a cheap labor source that works, well, for free because they are forced to, because they are slaves. Now, what did the Democrats support if they're against this and against this and against this? Well, they supported, this is hard. What did they like? They supported some of the immigrants that were coming to the United States at this time. You will see in the cities, Irish Catholics will form political machines for the Democratic Party, famously such as Tammany Hall in New York City. That was a Democratic Party. So immigrants will benefit from the Democrats in some ways. And mostly they support states' rights, so the planter class, Southern and Western independents, yeoman farmers who are kind of the lower to middle class perspective, they would be more likely to be Democrats. Okay. And that is the Democratic Party. And they will continue on after 1854 as the Democrats. And that's something else I want to just briefly mention with this is that the Democrats, they carry on. Yes, it's going to be called the Democrats from Andrew Jackson up until 2020, where when I'm currently filming this, it's still known as the Democratic Party. But the party that you see described here under Jackson, this is not, especially look right here, oppose government action in general, oppose government spending. This is the opposite of the Democratic Party in today's world in the United States. The parties have undergone enormous transformation as our nation has changed, particularly in the 20th century because of the Great Depression and the New Deal, because of the Civil Rights Movement, and many other factors. The parties have almost flipped and changed and evolved. So please don't conflate, don't confuse the Democratic Party under Jackson as the same thing, having the same beliefs as the Democratic Party today, because that's not the case. Now let's look at the Whigs. The Whigs will continue on in the Republican Party formed in the 1850s, who will elect its first Republican president with Abraham Lincoln in 1860. They supported larger government action. They support the social and moral reforms of the Second Great Awakening, such as temperance and abolition. And they are in favor of the tariff. They are in favor of the American system. They are huge support in New England and with bankers and merchants largely. So this is the new second party system. Let me move this down here. There we go. So now we get to Martin Van Buren's presidency, and remember, Jackson is going to step down after his 2 terms. So in 1836, Jackson is done, and he's going to pass the reins over to his chosen successor, who had first been his pick for Secretary of State, and then after all of the scandals and affairs, such as the one with Peggy Eaton and everything else, the Petticoat affair. Martin Van Buren will eventually, after John C. Calhoun's resignation over the nullification crisis, Martin Van Buren will become Jackson's vice president. And so he was the handpicked successor, basically, to Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren, son of immigrants, Dutch descent, the little fox of Kinderhook. He was seen as a political mastermind. He helped to basically create the Democratic Party in opposition to what he saw as the northern federalist shift of the Democratic Republicans under JQA and Clay. Martin Van Buren will become our 8th president, but he is just going to serve for 4 years, largely because of the mess that he was left by Jackson. And I am mainly talking about the bank wars, okay? And I'm mainly talking about a lot of the financial economic policies that were sown under Jackson's presidency. Martin Van Buren's going to have to pick up the pieces of, because just 2 months into Van Buren's presidency, this is in the summer of 1837, a panic grips the United States. Now, we saw one of these in 1819. Remember that a panic is like a depression. It's when you're going to see widespread unemployment due to layoffs at businesses and factories and industry. You're going to see a contraction of money in America. So there's not enough money to go around, and largely a lot of suffering due to economic ruin. That is a depression or a panic. Now, this one was caused because many land speculators, people who bought land out west, they'd been paying for that land in paper money from the pet banks. Pet banks were those little state and local banks that Jackson had given the money of the National Bank of the United States. When he killed it, he put that money from the National Bank into these state and local banks. And they were issuing loans like crazy to these land speculators who were in turn selling land and buying land like crazy, not based on actual sales or demand. Because this was so rampant and because inflation was getting out of hand, Jackson, before he left office, passed this or signed this law called the Specie Circular. It basically said that these land speculators, these people who bought Western lands, they must pay for their purchases, their land, in hard money, which is gold or silver. That is known as species money. They could not pay in paper notes because paper notes could not be trusted, since these pet banks, they were making them, printing them off, not based on anything in particular. They were not regulated because there was no national banking system. Because, oh yeah, why? Oh yeah, because Jackson had destroyed it, so there was no regulatory infrastructure for our economy. So that's one of the big reasons why this happens. And you can see basically the chain effects, that because the Specie Circular, due to inflation, the banknotes, the paper money, loses its value. It was not accepted. All these pet banks, they call in their loans. All of these speculators then have to pay back their loans because they're being called in, so they have no money. Land sales then plummet because these speculators can't buy land. And there's no money that's available because all of the hard money had to be basically exchanged and paid back. This is what you call liquidation, when basically everybody's having to pay back everything and there's no money left. You liquefy. And so businesses begin to fail. And we'll see a lot of factories and small businesses in the North and in the South start to go under and have to lay off workers. There were over 100,000 laid off in New York City at this time. And of course, Van Buren was from New York. He's from that state that is famous for its banking, New York City, the capital of of Wall Street and everything else today. And another point to this Panic of 1837 was the situation with the South. They had been, from 1830 to 1837, massively overproducing cotton due to new mechanization, due to especially like the Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Production of cotton doubled like within this short time period. And that's going to flood the market and lead to a drop in cotton prices. This is going to cause a panic in England, and then they will stop issuing their loans. They'll start to call in their money. And so it was also caused because of that. And when these loans are called in, especially to these Southern planters who were overproducing and kind of helping to cause this problem, they say, oh, we can't pay our money back, sorry. The states of like Alabama, Mississippi, these Southern states, they default on their loans. They don't pay them back because they can't. And they make that the burden to the poor Southerners, who in turn begin to have further distrust of the financial institutions, such as the banks. So that is Martin Van Buren's presidency. He was basically left with this mess, and he's going to be very ineffective at trying to solve it. In 1840, we have a new presidential election, and this is going to be, well, we'll see the first Whig candidate. The Whigs chose a very popular war hero from the War of 1812, the guy who beat Tecumseh. That is William Henry Harrison. He will run as the first Whig, and his vice president. And Harrison was from the Midwest, but he was also kind of a Southerner, and he owned slaves, but he's being supported by these Whigs, largely from the North. And his running mate, the Democrats, former Democrat, was John Tyler, who had a lot of problems with Jackson. So he jumped ship from the Democrats and joined this Whig ticket. And their campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And they even had like a little song about it, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, as the Battle of Tippecanoe was the famous battle where William Henry Harrison beat Tecumseh and the native forces in the War of 1812. And Tyler's the running mate, the vice presidential pick. And so with the financial crisis, the Panic of 1837, diminishing Martin Van Buren's presidential hopes, he will lose, and we have our first Whig president, William Henry Harrison. congratulations, Mr. Harrison, but unfortunately, it's not going to last. William Henry Harrison is very famous for one reason, and it's not because he became president as the first Whig, it's because of how short his presidency was. He is only in office for 32 days. Basically, Harrison gave a very long inaugural address. This was a very cold March in 1841, and he was not wearing as much overcoats as he probably should have been. He's an older man at this point. And so he contracts either pneumonia or a stomach virus or whatever it was. He ends up in bed for most of that first month as president, and then he dies just 32 days into office, the shortest presidency in our nation's history, William Henry Harrison. He will later have a grandson that will complete his 4 years. So I guess he gets some redemption there. That's Benjamin Harrison later on in the late 1800s. Now that leaves John Tyler as the first vice president to assume the role of president. And remember, Tyler is more in line with the Democratic Party than he is with the new Whig Party. Even though he ran as a Whig with William Henry Harrison, that was mainly just because Tyler hated Jackson. It wasn't really because his views were that different. John Tyler is a states' rights kind of guy. And the Whigs, they're going to have massive issues with Tyler being the president. They were fine with him being vice president because vice presidents don't get to do a whole lot. But now he's president, and that whole transition was also a huge issue. Like I said, this is the first time this ever happened where a vice president had to assume the office of the presidency. And there were many questions like, okay, so is he the temporary president? Do we call him, what do we call him? Does he assume all the responsibilities of the presidency? Like, how does this work? Well, Tyler basically took the initiative, as you can imagine, and said, I'm the president now, so deal with it. But many Whigs could not forgive his Democratic leanings and the fact that he vetoed legislation to renew the charter of a third national bank. He goes against a lot of Clay's American system. So Whigs such as Henry Clay and Daniel Webster in Congress, they constantly ridiculed and attacked the Tyler presidency because Tyler wasn't really a Whig. He was more of a Democrat. And so they called John Tyler his accidency, like he wasn't supposed to be president. There was also a famous accident that occurred on a New American warship that was taking a cruise down the Potomac right near Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And they'd invited many dignitaries and officials from the government, including President Tyler, on board to witness these two new double giant cannons that they were going to basically ignite for the viewers, for the presidents and these other spectators on board the ship. And one of the giant cannons was called the Peacemaker. And when they lit that giant cannon, it basically exploded, killing several of the people that were on the deck, including several of the members of Tyler's cabinet. And also Tyler's soon-to-be father-in-law was killed during this incident, which is how John Tyler basically finally wooed the very young girl that he was chasing and eventually marries her. And I think Tyler still has a living grandson because he was very old when he had children with her. And he had many children, Tyler did. But basically, Tyler's entire cabinet will leave him, and he's very unpopular. It's almost like, John Adams, a man without a political party. Democrats saw him as a traitor for running with the Whig ticket. Whigs saw him as a traitor because his policies were all very, of the Democratic Party. And this brings us to the issue of Texas, Tejas, because Texas was actually recognized as a foreign country, a republic, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson and Martin Van Buren refused to annex or add Texas to the United States during their presidencies in the 1830s because doing so would have triggered a war with Mexico. So let's talk for just a moment about the Texas Revolution, which is a pretty big deal, not only for our Texas history, but also for American history. It began in 1836, but the issues go back further, as they always do, back to the early colonization of our state. It was colonized by the Spanish, and eventually you start to get some English colonizers as well coming from the United States, largely by grants of land that were issued to them to a man named Moses Austin. Now, if that name Austin is triggering some bells, you're thinking, oh, Austin, like the capital of Texas. Good, because while Moses Austin dies, before he can have these land grants fulfilled and bring American settlers over, his son, Stephen F. Austin, will inherit these land grants and bring many thousands of American settlers to Texas. Now, in 1821, Texas, along with the rest of the American Southwest and all of what is today Mexico, broke away from Spain in the Mexican Revolution. And Mexico was able to achieve independence from Spain. So the land that is today our state of Texas was actually owned from 1821 until 1836 by the new nation of Mexico. Now, there were many Americans who wanted to add Texas, but a big reason why they could not was because of the growing sectional debate in the United States. The issue of whether new Western states would be admitted as slave states or as free states. And keep in mind, Texas is in the South. It does have many plantations at this time that were beginning. It did have slavery, and many of the American settlers that will be brought over to this territory that was belonging to Mexico, they brought with them their slaves. Now, under Mexican law, slavery was actually forbidden, and American settlers to Mexico had to become Mexican citizens. They had to give up their slaves. They had to learn to speak Spanish, and they had to convert to Catholicism, to the Catholic faith. Many of these American settlers found these requirements way too restrictive. They said, you can't take away my freedom to own slaves. You can't make me convert to Catholicism or to speak Spanish. And so it's largely these restrictions that are going to promote this revolution. And some of the Mexican policies were quite harsh. It wasn't just American settlers who were growing sick and tired of the Mexican regime and its oppression. There were also many native Spanish-born what do you call them? Tejans? I'm just really getting tired here, sorry. But there were many Spanish-born Texans as well who were also kind of getting sick of the Mexican regime. It was led by El Presidente, a dictator, the president of Mexico named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and he thought very highly of himself. Now, in the Texas Revolution, that's going to begin actually like March 2nd, 1836. That was Washington on the Brazos, where the Texans, the Texas statesmen, these American settlers are going to meet and draft a Declaration of Independence for Mexico, and they're going to formally break away. This is right when, right around March 6th, the Alamo falls. This is when the Texas Revolution begins. Now, the Alamo, pictured right there in the center, you know, in San Antonio. Hopefully you get a chance, if you haven't already, sometime to go down to San Antonio and visit it. It's preserved very well. The Alamo was a former Spanish mission, and it was a fort. And the defenders there, they thought that they could hold out against a Mexican army. What they didn't count on was Santa Anna, the president of Mexico, leading a force of several thousand to come and take them. And this was after, like at Gonzales, the Mexicans had tried to take several small cannons that they had lent to these American Texas settlers. And the Texans drafted a flag that said, "Come and take it." It was a white flag with a cannon on it. "Come and take the cannon." And they had beaten back the Mexicans there. I think it was all of like 5 people in that first skirmish at Gonzales. But at the Alamo, It was proven just how deadly this was going to be. Santa Anna used overwhelming force to overwhelm the defenders like David Bowie and William Travis. Travis drafts a famous letter to other Texans right before the Alamo is taken, basically saying, um, give me liberty or give me death kind of thing. And of course, also famously at the Alamo, one of the last defenders to be killed, probably executed after his surrender, because Santa Anna, unbeknownst to the Texans, had basically said he was going to give no quarter. That meant that even if you surrendered, you would still be executed. And so one of those people to be executed right there at the end of the defense of the Alamo was none other than Davy Crockett, famous American frontiersman and statesman from Tennessee, was hoping to help the Texas cause and also probably further his own ambitions. His brilliant political rise was cut short there. The only people that were spared at the Alamo were some of the women and slaves that were there. And they were sent to go and dispatch Santa Anna's message that there would be no quarter forgiven for those that were in open revolution against Mexico. Santa Anna was very brutal. And this was proven even more so at Goliad. Like the Alamo is famous as a last stand. It's like a Thermopylae, like the 300 and stuff. That basically every last defender of the Alamo is killed, but at least they died fighting. Like David Bowie was hung up in bed being very sick. David Bowie, the famous like Bowie knife. But he still like supposedly died fighting off, from his bed with his knife. With Goliad, the large contingent of Texans there at the mission at Goliad, they knew they were overwhelmed and couldn't resist anymore. So their commander basically ordered them to surrender, wave the white flag. He didn't know about Santa Anna's order, of course, and it's reported that the Mexican general in charge also felt sick to his stomach at having to do this. So he actually resigned his post and gave it to his lieutenant, his next in command, who then went ahead and lined up all of these surrendered Texans at Goliad and then summarily had them shot, people who had surrendered. So this was seen as especially vicious. So when we get to the famous battle of San Jacinto, which is where Sam Houston pictured right here, he was a follower of Jackson, a big Jacksonian. He'd been a congressman from Tennessee. Sam Houston is going to be a very, very important Texan figure. At this point, he was named kind of like the George Washington of Texas. He's the commander of our Texas forces. And he had been, like George Washington, running and running and running away from Santa Anna's large army, not because Sam Houston was a coward, but because he was a brilliant military leader. He knew that it would be suicide to take his much smaller force against this enormous Mexican army under the control of the president, Santa Anna. And so Sam Houston, he hears about he actually ordered the defenders of the Alamo to get their butts out of there. But Travis, who had been kind of in charge since Bowie was sick in bed, had refused to leave. And so they hear about the Alamo. They hear about Goliad and what happened there. And Houston, trying to get to the statesmen who were hiding out near Galveston Island. So this all comes down to the coast, like kind of down going towards where Houston is. He's planning a last-ditch effort because he hears that Santa Anna has split his army. And so this is the best chance that the Texans will have on the fields of San Jacinto, which if you go to San Jacinto today on the coastal plain, you can see this super large obelisk with the big star, the lone star at the top of it. And that obelisk right there at San Jacinto marks the victory of the Texans over the Mexicans and the birth of Texas as its own nation, our independence from Mexico. And right there is the battleship Texas, which you can also view. That was a very famous battleship that was used not only in World War I, but also in World War II. It's one of the very few ships of that era of both world wars that is still preserved for viewers and visitors to go and see today. So that's down near the Houston area. And the Battle of San Jacinto it's an amazing story, and there's many legends surrounding it, such as the Yellow Rose of Texas, a prostitute of Texas affiliation that had lured Santa Anna El Presidente into her tent and distracted him. There's other legends about famously Sam Houston's drunkenness, and that he had been so drunk that when it was typically time to begin a battle in the very early dawn morning hours, he was hungover and asleep. And so the Texans did not attack when the Mexicans were expecting, but instead chose to attack after the Mexicans had already given up there being a fight for that day and had gone and taken an afternoon nap, a siesta, they called it. And since the Mexicans were totally distracted and sleeping basically in the middle of the day, at the time you would least expect a battle to happen, because like who on earth would be crazy enough to attack in broad daylight, right in the middle of the day? That is when Sam Houston roused himself and his Texan forces, and they shouted, "Remember Goliad! Remember the Alamo! Remember these Texans that have fallen!" And they charged, and they offered no quarter. Well, some quarter, but they killed a lot of Mexicans very brutally in the swamps there at San Jacinto. They hunted them down. And another great story slash legend about the Battle of San Jacinto was that Santa Anna, in panic, took on the guise of a private in his army, of a lowly soldier in the Mexican army. And he hopped on one of the horses that had been procured from a local farm, a little white, old mare. And the horse took off with Santa Anna, the president of Mexico. And basically, that was how the Texans captured this Mexican soldier, who the Mexican soldiers started pointing to and saying, "El Presidente," and saluting and stuff, kind of telling the Texans what they had just captured was not just some lowly private, but actually the president of the nation that they were fighting against. And with Santa Anna's capture, you can see in this portrait right here, here's Sam Houston wounded in the leg, and here's Santa Anna captured, basically being forced to sign the surrender, for his life. Texas will become free. Now, Mexico, obviously, Santa Anna goes back to Mexico and immediately says that this treaty does not apply and that Texas still belonged to Mexico. But from 1836 to 1845, the Republic of Texas was born, and Texas will be an independent nation for that time period, recognized in 1836 by none other than Andrew Jackson. And it's under Tyler's presidency that the Texans will vote to join the United States. And President Tyler, through a joint resolution of Congress, which doesn't require 2/3 majority, just a simple majority, actually, Tyler is the president to annex officially the Republic of Texas and have Texas join the United States, which immediately, we will talk definitely more about this in the next lecture, will cause the Mexican-American War. Because Mexico had not given up its hopes of reclaiming Texas, and it also was about disputes between the United States and Mexico over this land and other westward territories as well. One other thing I want you to keep in mind, though, before I leave you off on this Texas Revolution and the great stories surrounding it, is that these American settlers in Texas, one of the biggest reasons why they opposed Mexican rule was because they were not allowed to keep their slavery. Okay, and one of the biggest reasons why the United States could not, for the longest time, for those 9 years when Texas was an independent republic, add Texas to the Union was because of the issue of slavery. Because Texas would enter, and it will in 1845, as a slave-owning state. Okay. And we will in 1861 be part of the Confederate States because we were slave owning. So keep that issue in mind. All right. And with that, I will talk to you guys later. Thank you guys so much. And goodbye.